Greetings. Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Wednesday, January 15th, 2025. On Wednesdays, we deal with emotional well-being and relationships. I hope you'll find today's vlog especially interesting and helpful because we're dealing with an incredibly important issue and a follow-up to last week's vlog. In particular, we're going to be looking at anger management. So let's jump right in. How do we deal with and confront angry people? You'll see I put confronting in quotation marks because do we really want to confront during a confrontation? By definition, that almost implies we're assuredly going to escalate things. And in most instances, nearly all, I would hope all, we don't want to do that. Perhaps you've heard the famous parable of the Buddha who's confronted by an angry man. So, according to the parable, the Buddha has traveled quite some distance and he's going to deliver a public speech. Whereupon, as he arrives and as he starts his speech, a man starts angrily shouting insults at him. The Buddha ignores this, continues on with his talk, and this only infuriates the man even more. So he gets increasingly agitated and angry and hurls even more serious insults at the Buddha. And yet the Buddha continued his talk until the man stood up and so enormously frustrated at the turn of events, he goes right in front of the Buddha and says, "Why don't you get angry? Do you hear what I'm saying?" And the Buddha, of course, calmly says to him or asks him a question and he says, if someone offers you a gift and you refuse to accept the gift, to whom does the gift belong? The man was taken aback, of course, and he stopped, just thought for a moment. He said, well, it still belongs to you. It belongs to the person who offered the gift. And the Buddha said, exactly. In the same way, I choose not to accept your anger and insults. The man, of course, learned an important lesson there from the wise Buddha. That is to say that responding to negativity and hostility with compassion and understanding can transform even the most challenging of situations. So, what would you do if you were confronted by some rude or obnoxious person? You ever been in a situation? Somebody who's saying things that are hurtful or even hateful towards you. Would you meet fire with fire? That is to say, with ire. Yeah, you can do that if you'd prefer to burn everything down. That's what happens with fire, as we've learned all too depressingly in LA, for example. And of course, that's not the best outcome. Can never be. That said, there's no one right answer to this question. I mean, with a child, there's the strategy of simply trying to ignore them. The child gets increasingly angry or frustrated and does all sorts of wacky things. And in that sense, ignorance, being ignorant of the child, can be effective. Usually not with adults. So instead, I would recommend using your IPDE strategy that, if you're like me, you would have learned during your driver's training back in the 1970s. It's an acronym that stands for Identify, Predict, Decide, and Execute. So you start with an assessment. That is to say, you start with an assessment of the situation. Identify what's happening and try to trust your instincts if possible. And the idea is that do you have an opportunity at the outset to realistically intervene in a positive or a constructive way? And in particular, can you de-escalate the situation? Okay? Look for possible signs in terms of the person, or the individual who's upset, or whatever the case may be. Are they, look at their facial expressions. Are they sweating? Do they have a clenched jaw? Are they trembling? Do they have a rapid breath? Uh, what else is happening? What else are they giving off? And again, you can't know for certain. All you can do is try to identify the information and make your best assessment. Most important, perhaps you can determine whether the person's already clearly past a breaking point or a point where they can be reached. And maybe they're tripping on drugs, right? Or they're unreachable for whatever reason. And so, based on the information that you had, you then have to make a prediction about the most likely or plausible outcomes. And very quickly, in some cases, you'll have to render a decision as to what to do next and then execute on your plan. So, if there's a chance, you can listen attentively and actively to what's being said. You can start with empathy and understanding, believe it or not. The reason you should do that is because in many instances, the anger is not even necessarily about you. Yes, it's being directed at you in that moment, but the source of the person's frustrations and so forth may be entirely different. And so, in many instances, people are simply frustrated and they want to be heard, and you happen to be the closest person. And so, you can try to acknowledge the person and uh, validate that they're being heard without judgment. And that doesn't mean, though, that you're condoning the anger. You're just trying to de escalate. And if that's your aim, empathy and compassion are probably the best place to start. Again, we're not necessarily all able to do that. And if they do ask, do you hear me? Do you hear what I'm saying? You can say, yes, I can hear you. Try to do that again in a nodding and in an affirmative way and a non-threatening way. And you could even restate what they've said, kind of a Rogerian therapeutic approach. But again, do so as calmly as possible and as gently and so on. And you could even try the Buddhist approach. But in our culture, and with some people, that won't necessarily work, of course. And in some cases, you may have to, or you might sense that the person's already in such a state of agitation that an empathetic response just isn't realistic or isn't going to help. And in fact, you may have to look for an exit strategy. And if there's not an exit available, you may have to try to create distance between yourself and the person who's launching the verbal tirade against you. Again, especially if you feel like things are escalating quickly or you feel like it's getting to be a threatening situation, an even more threatening situation. Believe it or not, there are some cases where you can even try humor, usually directed at yourself or the absurdity of the situation, or simply as a means of trying to disarm the person. A real life example happened to me years ago. I was visiting South America and traveling around South America with a friend of mine, a native Peruano. But we had flown to Buenos Aires in Argentina. And we were out one evening. We were there for 3 days, and we were out one evening just, having fun, window shopping, doing whatever. It's a very European city. Things really start happening later in the evening, etc. And long story short, we got separated, but not too far. And I was just kind of, I don't remember what I was browsing in a window and that sort of thing. And somebody came up to me and he had sort of had his hand in his coat like this. And he said something to me. And I didn't really notice. It was sort of out of the side of my eye. And I wasn't really, paying attention. Um, but I said, oh, hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? I was just being friendly. I was greeting him in Spanish, of course. And he sort of stepped back. He was literally taken aback by my response. And this all happened literally within 3, 4 seconds. And the guy actually sort of shuffled off. And my friend came around the corner at the same time. Again, this is all within a matter of seconds. He said, Joe, are you all right? I said, yeah, of course. Why? He goes, what happened with that guy? I said, I don't know. He said something. I stuck my hand out. I was trying to say hello. And he goes, so you didn't hear what he said? I said, no. He said, arriba las manos. I said, oh, put your hands up. He was trying to rob you. I said, oh, I didn't know. I thought, I didn't really hear him, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it was kind of a funny situation, and I disturbed him by my response. So sometimes you can disturb the disturbed by being the disturbed one, and that's essentially what happened. But and again, we asked the police later, and apparently people will come up to others, and especially foreigners, like like I saw. I guess they looked like whatever, and they'll put their hand in their pocket. They don't necessarily have a gun, but they want to be threatening or appear threatening, and then that's the way they rob people. Uh, he didn't necessarily have a gun, and if you had a gun, you'd get in massive trouble. But anyway, so got out of that situation quite unexpectedly and accidentally by being kind of a nut. So anyway, and of course, with my friend coming to my rescue, so to speak, that's always a good strategy too. Is there anybody else in the vicinity? Anybody else who can be pulled into the conversation, right? And help diffuse things. And again, be careful. They should be old enough, and capable enough to be involved. A third person can help create that buffer and be a calming influence. But you don't want to pull a child into that situation. That's not healthy or safe. And be careful because you don't want to pull somebody in who's maybe likely to take sides and escalate the situation or lose it themselves, right? So these are some of the ways of dealing with people who approach you verbally with anger and they're upset and they're you're anticipating that it might even get much worse if you don't do something. But what if, Mikowski, you're actually physically attacked? Now we've gone beyond the words. And let's be real, right? Even the Buddha believed, even though he believed in nonviolence, nevertheless allowed for the monks to defend themselves if they were physically attacked, right? So what would the Buddha do? What would Jesus do? All these questions, right? The caveat is that the response to the attack, at least in the terms of the monks, had to be aimed at diffusing the situation and should never involve, seriously hurting somebody or injuring their attackers. And again, the whole purpose would be to do anything that would help diffuse or de escalate the situation. Uh, a second caveat, there are obviously some situations where you don't really have a choice and you have to react in an instant. God forbid you ever encounter a situation where you've got an active shooter, for example. There's really nothing you can do proactively then at that point to diffuse the situation. And indeed, if they've already started, safety has to be the number one priority. And that's why, of course, the police sometimes have to use even deadly force, depending on the circumstances, right? And so hopefully that'll never happen to you. It's never happened to me. It's going to be quite rare in the grander scheme of things. But you could at some point randomly be targeted for no good reason and have no choice but to respond, perhaps in kind, but especially if there's no other exit strategy. So, under those most dire of circumstances, you want to find safety, you want to exit the situation and be able to protect yourself. And metaphorically, though, if the fire has already started, so to speak, you really don't have too many options other than to try to get yourself to safety. Maybe, pull the fire alarm or call 911. But again, these are the most extreme circumstances where you really don't have the chance or the choice to exercise reason in talking to someone. In most cases, in normal circumstances, shall we say, what would you do though if you were encountered with an aggressive or hostile person who appears intent upon physically attacking you? Okay. And again, it depends. There's no one right definitive answer. But let me suggest this at the outset. If you believe in this notion of eye for an eye, that is to say, if someone attacks you, or someone, if you think that the person that attacks you, even a loved one, then deserves to be hurt, then you need to recognize that in some ways, belief, your own thinking is very much similar to, or not that different from the attacker, right? Because the attacker thinks you deserve to be attacked for whatever reason. And of course, you don't. But then, if you in turn think that your attacker deserves to be physically hurt in response or assaulted as a result of attacking you, well, again, you're essentially saying that you have a similar belief system. So that's quite the challenge. And I don't know about you, but I have at times in the past, especially when I was younger and growing up, but even in adulthood, responded with aggression to people who are aggressing against me, or even if they were emotionally or psychologically, I felt like they were attacking me. Okay. But again, just speaking for myself, I've never concluded that they deserved my response, even if I felt like they were really pretty horribly attacking myself. But if I've responded and I've lost control or gotten really angry in response, I've never, this again, just speak for myself, I've never concluded, wow, they really deserve that. Right? And in fact, usually, if I've hurt somebody else in return or in response, I've never felt good about that. I've never, in any circumstance, I've never felt good about hurting someone, right? Even if they attack first. In fact, just the opposite. I usually feel horrible if I've lost it or if I've done something to hurt someone else. That's how I know I'm not a psychopath. But anyway, where does that leave us then? Well, it took me years, decades, literally a lifetime to learn that no, I don't condone anger, responding with violence or with anger. And yet there are circumstances where you may be confronted and you may find yourself in those most difficult of circumstances. And so this took me, about 55 years of living on the planet. I can be a slow learner at times. And so, of course, I'm not a Buddha by any stretch, but after all these decades and several decades of studying violence, both empirically and philosophically, I think I finally do have an understanding of how to deal with anger in general. And I think I've learned that in a deeper way, and not just an emotional response, but even a cognitive and even a spiritual response, if you will. And so, in the immediacy of the situation, what can you do? Well, here's how you can respond, and to me, it's just like preparing for anything. You need to follow the eightfold path of conflict resolution, and there's it's very Buddhist, and there you'll notice that the C is in quotation marks there. And that's because there are eight C's you can follow. So first, you want to start with having a clear purpose and objectives that you'd like to communicate if confronted, and control your fear and emotions if possible. Remaining calm helps you to execute whatever plan you've decided on, and it reduces further the likelihood of antagonizing or provoking the other person. Breathe deeply and talk slowly. Maintain non threatening eye contact if possible. And clarify the situation where possible in an effort to diffuse or at least lower the temperature. Relatedly, you want to act slowly and deliberately. Be calm under all circumstances. Avoid abrupt gestures, right? Communicate through your actions and your statements and your being that you're going to remain calm and that you're not going to accept the gift of violence or anger that the other person's offering. And appeal to your common framework, hopefully, of understanding and ideally the better nature of your attacker. It doesn't always work. If you know their name, use their name. Humanize them as much as possible, while also, of course, humanizing yourself. And communicate the importance of your relationship with the other person. Now, again, it depends on what the nature of that relationship is with your attacker. But find ways to communicate the importance of being calm and having a relationship with the person, whatever that may be, however ephemeral that may be. But understand or try to communicate that that relationship transcends the immediacy of the volatile situation, right? And so if you don't have a relationship with the person typically, you can still appeal to the more general humanity and human decency if possible. Again, that might not work. And so, especially if they're on drugs or they've experienced a psychotic break and so forth. So, again, you have to read the situation. But to the best of your ability, then find a way to communicate with the person uh, that who you are, and that's not who they are. That's not the best version of themselves. If you have to then use violence, and you may, then it should be controlled violence, a controlled physical response, again, aimed at not escalating the violence further. Control and adapt your response to the situation at hand, to the circumstances that you're confronted with. And again, kind of use the least aggressive means necessary, if you will, to get the job done. And then continue the conversation about the concerns, their concerns, as best you can, even if you've had to be physical. Continue to listen attentively. Encourage the other person to express themselves, but avoid agreeing on the inappropriate forms of expression or anger or violence. I understand what you're saying, but there's a different way. We need to work towards finding that other way, right? I hear your concerns. Let's figure out how we can talk about this. Again, in some cases, though, especially if people are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or again, they have a mental health condition, or they forgot to take their meds, so literally, whatever the case may be, reason may not be an option. Okay, finally, what about longer term strategies? Now, set aside for the moment your daily encounters. Wouldn't you ideally rather have a set of anger management strategies that you could apply regularly or universally if needed? And to be effective in this regard, it's like anything else. You've got to practice. Okay. So at the top of my list, in terms of confronting anger and especially anger in yourself, would be cognitive behavioral or cognitive restructuring approaches. Okay. A lot of our anger and that of others comes because they're just reacting and we're reacting to the immediacy of the situation or what somebody's done, or we're frustrated from something else and we end up taking that out on others. Okay. And so it's almost like we're just taken over by our emotions. And even worse, we've often developed longer term habits or patterns of responding in particular ways or to certain triggers. Okay. And maybe we've been doing that for decades. So, one of the best things that you can do for yourself would be to change the way you think about things and events, people, relationships, situations, even volatile encounters. And so you have to commit to thinking before acting and anticipating how you'd like to interpret situations that, if you will, um, reduce the likelihood of your getting angry and, or expressing that frustration through angry and inappropriate ways. So, cognitive behavioral strategies, in my view, are the sort of the best overarching way to literally rethink how you approach life. And you may not be able to do that on your own, but we'll get to that, or how you get help in that regard. And then a very simple technique in general is simply giving yourself a break, even in the heat of the moment. The old counting to 10 concept in your mind before responding. The important thing is to, in general, develop strategies that will allow you to refocus your energy without getting upset, without responding in anger. And you can't necessarily rethink the whole situation, but 10 seconds or counting to 10 is just enough of a break in many instances to allow yourself to calm your nerves and, again, focus your mind and so forth before responding in a tense situation. Again, in terms of long-term strategies, I think it's incredibly important that we practice and develop these, whatever they may be, that helps with the calming of your mind and the calming of your being, right? Uh, and again, you're going to run into all sorts of things in the course of daily living, all right? And do you really want to be a prisoner of unhinged emotions or automatic responses, especially if those responses are in general unhealthy or hurtful? So instead, you can commit to developing healthier daily strategies using techniques like meditation or yoga, exercise, going for long walks, and a host of other relaxation techniques. These obviously are intended to help you take the edge off, to gradually calm the self, and in the grander scheme of things, create a newer you. But remember, you can't just do this once or twice. In order to achieve that newer you, you have to establish a daily routine, a habit of practicing, of training, and using these strategies regularly, just as you would if you wanted to be a really good runner or, whatever, or learn a new language. You have to practice daily to get better at it. Improved communication and listening skills are always a good thing to have in your arsenal. That sounds violent too. And that probably starts literally with being a better listener first rather than a better speaker, although being a more thoughtful speaker is a great asset as well. So we all have cognitive biases that shape what and how we take in our information. So try to learn what your biases are and then activate the understanding of your biases when you encounter someone so that you can almost anticipate what your actions and reactions might be, what your biases are. Especially if you know, for example, that you're going to be entering into a situation where you're dealing with a strained relationship, or you already anticipate that maybe there's been a conflict in the past. And so you're anticipating that in your next encounter, there's going to be conflict, or at that meeting at work, or even with that loved one. And so, in that sense, you need to prepare yourself beforehand not to be drawn into the drama, not to accept the gift of anger, not to be triggered by the conventional triggers, of which you're probably all too well aware. Maybe you're not aware. And the point is that you can oftentimes disarm people right at the outset. Okay. It doesn't mean that you, again, have to oblige them or their anger, but you can show them that you're going to approach the situation and them with a different mindset. Okay. And that you're willing to listen and that you're not going to get crazy or upset, or you're not going to let them make you crazy or upset, even if they themselves start to lose it. Okay? Um, and in some instances, though, there's literally situations where it doesn't work, or you don't, there are people that, I mean, even if you've changed yourself in your strategies and your approaches, there are going to be times where you may still have to avoid certain people or situations altogether, right? Or maybe even permanently. You may need a permanent break from some people or some situations because, the people are particularly abusive and they're, even if you've changed, they haven't changed their patterns. And, repeated exposure to the same toxic environment is, even if even though you're trying to approach the Buddha in your approach to life, that can be extraordinarily difficult. Most of us just aren't capable of doing that, right? And again, even if you've changed, it doesn't mean that even after repeated exposure, that the other person's necessarily going to change. Okay. So again, there may be uh, people and situations and contexts where you have to, practice some avoidance, at least for a period of time. And if possible, though, perhaps you can change the environments themselves, right? Or if you have control over the situation. For example, if you're frustrated with regular traffic or heavy traffic going to work at 8 a.m., you could conceivably try to change your schedule and maybe go at 7, right, when there's less traffic. I mean, that's a very simple, but perhaps an important example in many of our lives, right? But there are countless examples in life where we can be a bit more proactive in terms of changing how we do things or changing up our routines that can lessen the stressors and the tension and all the stuff that's more likely to trigger an angry response in the first place. Personally, again, I also like to try to use a lot of humor if possible, especially in terms of deflecting criticism or, in addressing even my own shortcomings, right? Humor can definitely be a defense that's extremely helpful and even I would say at times a healthy defense mechanism. Um, and so someone might attack you in anger or whatever, and you can respond with some type of, self-deprecating humor, right? They call you an idiot. You can respond with, well, every village needs an idiot, so I'm just doing my job, something like that. Again, it depends on the tenseness of the situation and the circumstances and so on. But again, if you can sort of point to the absurdity of the characterization or reference a funny line from a movie or a play or whatever, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but humor can be a great way to lessen the tension if you do it right. But again, that takes practice, and you have to be able to read the room, as they say. And then finally, of course, I'd argue that almost everyone can benefit from counseling at some point, and maybe on multiple occasions in their lives, right? Even those who are quite healthy otherwise might still benefit from learning a bit more about oneself or about one's own blind spots or weaknesses or ongoing sources of frustration, whatever the case. Just hearing another person's perspective or getting some advice can really make a difference in our lives. So don't be afraid to ask. Don't deny yourself the chance to get better. Don't convince yourself somehow that you're not worthy or that you don't deserve to get better or to make a positive change in your life. You absolutely do. You're capable of changing and you're definitely worth it. Okay, so I hope this has helped. And as ever, until tomorrow or until we next meet, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. Bye for now.